My brother stole our $6 million inheritance, but he never expected this revenge plan to ruin his life. And then I stood by the gravesite, the biting wind cutting through my coat, but the chill was nothing compared to the weight pressing against my chest. The sound of the priest's voice droned on in the background, his words blurring into an indistinct hum as my father's casket was slowly lowered into the ground. The finality of it all settled over me like a heavy shroud, suffocating and inescapable. Yet even in my grief, I could feel the sharp tension radiating from the man standing beside me. My older brother, Vincent, remained motionless, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his face unreadable. I knew him well enough to recognize the way his jaw tensed, the way his shoulders locked into place, the way his fingers twitched just slightly, as if he were holding back something that threatened to spill over. He wasn't mourning. He was waiting. As soon as the funeral ended and the last handful of dirt had been tossed onto the casket, Vincent wasted no time. He moved swiftly, gripping my wrist with a force just firm enough to make a statement, but not hard enough to draw attention from the scattering guests around us. His voice was low, his breath warm against my ear despite the cold. He didn't offer condolences, didn't ask if I was holding up, didn't acknowledge that we had just buried the only real parent we had left. Instead, his words came blunt and direct, cutting through the moment like a blade. He wanted to talk, but I already knew what this conversation would be about. I could feel the impatience rolling off him in waves, his frustration barely restrained beneath the surface. I didn't want to do this here, not in front of distant relatives who barely knew us, not in the cemetery where our father had just been laid to rest, not when my grief was still so raw that I could hardly string together a coherent thought. But Vincent never cared about timing, never cared about tact, never considered anyone else's emotions when he wanted something. When I told him we could discuss this later, I already knew that later would never be enough for him. His grip on my wrist tightened slightly before he let go, his eyes narrowing as he took a step back and exhaled sharply through his nose. Then he said it, the words I had been bracing myself for. He demanded his half of the inheritance. Not asked, not requested, not inquired, demanded, as if it was something he was entitled to, as if it was something he had worked for, as if it was something that had been wrongfully taken from him. I turned to face him fully, my stomach twisting at the words, my pulse beating an unsteady rhythm against my ribs. My father had left everything to me, the house we grew up in, his savings, his business, the entire estate worth $6 million. It wasn't favoritism, it wasn't an attempt to punish Vincent, it wasn't done out of spite. It was done because my father knew his son, knew him better than Vincent ever knew himself, knew that if he left him with a fortune, it would be gone in months, spent recklessly with nothing to show for it, but a trail of bad decisions. He had seen it before, seen the way Vincent burned through his own savings, seen the way he had wasted the small inheritance our mother had left us when she died. My father had spent years trying to help him, trying to guide him, trying to save him from himself, but in the end, he had made a choice. And that choice had been me. I told Vincent the truth, my voice steady despite the way my heart pounded violently in my chest. This wasn't my decision, wasn't something I had asked for, wasn't something I could change even if I wanted to. Our father had made this choice with full awareness of the consequences, and nothing either of us said now would change what was written in that will. Vincent's expression darkened immediately, his lips twisting into something bitter, something filled with resentment, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for years and was only now being given the space to rise. He scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief, then laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that carried the weight of anger behind it. He accused me of always being our father's favorite, accused me of manipulation, accused me of sitting on money that he believed was rightfully his while he struggled. I knew better than to let his words get to me, knew that he was grasping at anything that would justify his anger, but still, it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I had spent my entire life cleaning up after Vincent's messes, had spent years watching him make the same mistakes over and over again, had given him chance after chance after chance, only to be met with the same disappointment every single time. He wasn't struggling. He was wasting, just like he always had, just like he always would. When I said it, when I finally let the words slip out, his face turned red with rage. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his body vibrating with barely restrained fury. Then, with one final glare, he spat out a warning, a promise, a threat disguised as a parting shot before he turned and stormed off. He told me I would regret this. I stood there, watching as he disappeared into the crowd of mourners, my chest tight, my father's final words echoing in my mind. He had warned me about this, had told me in no uncertain terms that I couldn't trust Vincent with money, had told me that if given the chance, he would destroy himself with it. I hadn't even had time to properly mourn before greed had reared its ugly head, before my own brother had turned my loss into another battleground. The inheritance had barely been settled, and already I was at war. 2 weeks had passed since the funeral, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of grief suffocating me. The funeral had been exhausting, the legal meetings even more so, but at least the paperwork had been finalized, the estate settled, and my father's affairs properly handled. I had spent every waking moment making sure everything was in order, making sure nothing had been overlooked, making sure that my father's wishes had been respected. Now that the hardest part was over, I needed an escape, something to clear my head, something to make me feel like a person again rather than just a daughter drowning in the aftermath of death and responsibility. I booked a short trip to Lisbon, Portugal, telling myself that a change of scenery, even for just a little while, would give me the clarity I so desperately needed. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. Long walks through the narrow cobblestone streets, the scent of fresh bread and strong coffee lingering in the air, the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore as I sat on the beach, allowing myself, for the first time in weeks, to simply exist without the constant pressure of grief weighing me down. I drank wine at small outdoor cafes, let the warmth of the sun seep into my skin, and tried to push away the chaos that had consumed my life for far too long. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I could finally exhale. That illusion shattered on the 4th day when my phone buzzed on the cafe table in front of me, the familiar vibration sending a ripple of unease through my body before I even picked it up. I glanced down, expecting nothing more than a simple message from a friend or an email reminding me of something I had already forgotten, but the moment I saw Vincent's name flashing across the screen, my stomach dropped. I hesitated before opening the message, my fingers tightening around the glass of wine in my other hand, dread curling in my gut like a sickness I couldn't shake. I inhaled sharply, trying to brace myself, trying to prepare for whatever nonsense he had decided to drag me into now, but nothing could have prepared me for what I read next. I've taken Dad's house. Changed the locks. It's mine now. Don't bother trying to fight me on this. I blinked, rereading the message twice, 3 times, 4, trying to wrap my head around the sheer stupidity of what he had just said. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the words, letting the absurdity of it settle over me, trying to comprehend the level of delusion required for him to believe that changing the locks on a house somehow made it his. And then, to my absolute disbelief, I laughed. I laughed out loud in the middle of the quiet cafe, earning a few confused glances from the people around me, but I didn't care. Because what Vincent had just done, what he had so boldly declared as some kind of victory, was the single dumbest mistake of his life. I set my glass down, my fingers tightening around my phone as I started typing a response, feeling an unexpected sense of amusement rather than anger, because this, more than anything, proved exactly why our father had left everything to me. Vincent had always been reckless, always impulsive, always believing that if he wanted something badly enough, he could take it without consequence. He had spent his entire life bulldozing through problems, making messes, and expecting other people to clean them up, taking what he felt he deserved even when it wasn't his to take. But this time, he hadn't just crossed a line, he had obliterated it. I kept my response simple, sending back only 4 words. That's cute, Vincent. Let me know how that works out for you. I pressed send and leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, already knowing exactly how this was going to play out. Vincent thought he had won, thought that by physically taking the house, he had somehow beaten me, had somehow gotten what he was owed. What he didn't realize, what he had so spectacularly overlooked in his blind desperation to claim something that was never his, was that he had just made a critical legal mistake. It didn't matter that he had changed the locks, didn't matter that he had taken physical possession, didn't matter that he believed in his delusions that this was some grand victory. Because in the eyes of the law, the house still belonged to me. I flagged down the waiter, asked for the check, and booked the first available flight home. By the time I landed back in Chicago, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin, but there was no room for fatigue, no time for jet lag, no patience for anything other than setting things right. The first thing I did, before even stepping foot in my apartment, was call my lawyer, a man my father had trusted for years, a man who knew Vincent almost as well as I did. The moment he answered, his tone warm but professional, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "I assume you already know why I'm calling." There was a pause, then a knowing sigh. "I had a feeling this would happen," he admitted, his voice laced with something that sounded a lot like exhaustion. "We received an alert from the house's security system a few days ago. Unauthorized entry. I was waiting for you to return before taking action." I wasn't surprised. My father, ever the meticulous planner, had made sure that his estate was legally and securely protected long before he passed. The will was ironclad, the ownership transferred immediately, the security system still monitored by his legal team. Vincent thought he had taken something from me, thought he had won, thought that this was some grand act of defiance, but all he had really done was break into a house that didn't belong to him. "I want to handle this smartly," I said, pacing the length of my apartment, my exhaustion giving way to adrenaline. "I don't want this to turn into a drawn-out legal battle. I just want it shut down fast." There was a thoughtful hum on the other end of the line, the kind my lawyer made when he was weighing all available options before giving his final verdict. "You have two choices. Press charges for trespassing and theft, which would be well within your rights, or give him the opportunity to leave voluntarily before we escalate this any further." I already knew that Vincent wouldn't leave willingly, already knew that no matter how much logic or reason I threw at him, he would fight this until the bitter end. But I also knew Vincent well enough to understand that giving him the illusion of control, letting him believe that he still had a chance to come out of this unscathed, would make his downfall even sweeter. "Give him a little rope," I said, glancing at the time, already planning my next move. "Let's see how much he hangs himself with." By the time I pulled up to my father's house later that evening, the sky had already darkened, the streetlights casting long, stretched-out shadows across the pavement. The familiar sight of the house, the place I had grown up in, the place where my father had spent his last days, the place that legally belonged to me, felt entirely foreign now that Vincent had decided to claim it as his own. I sat in my car for a few moments, gripping the steering wheel, forcing my breathing to remain steady, forcing my anger to remain contained. There was no point in letting my emotions get the better of me, not when I had the upper hand, not when this entire situation would soon be nothing more than another cautionary tale about my brother's inability to think beyond his own selfish impulses. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel driveway, my gaze immediately landing on the front door where the new locks Vincent had installed gleamed under the dim porch light. He was making a point, trying to show me that he was in control, trying to make it clear that he had no intention of leaving. But the only thing it really proved was that he was willing to dig himself deeper into a hole he had no chance of crawling out of. Without hesitation, I rang the doorbell, the sharp chime echoing through the house, cutting through the silence like a knife. I waited, my patience already wearing thin, my heartbeat steady despite the irritation boiling beneath my skin. When no answer came, I rang the bell again, longer this time, making it clear that I had no intention of leaving without a response. From inside, I could hear the faintest shuffling sound, the unmistakable creak of floorboards, the quiet rustling of someone moving just out of sight. Vincent was inside. He was deliberately ignoring me, standing just beyond the door, pretending that if he stayed silent long enough, I would simply give up and walk away. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, at the sheer childishness of a grown man playing this ridiculous game, at the fact that he genuinely thought he could win. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number, pressing it to my ear, listening to the rings echo through the house. When he finally answered, his voice was sharp, filled with irritation, filled with the kind of forced confidence that told me he knew exactly why I was here and had already convinced himself that he was untouchable. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, his words clipped, his tone bored, as if I had inconvenienced him, as if I was the one overstepping. I leaned against the doorframe, my voice calm, my amusement barely concealed beneath the surface. "Well, for starters, I want my house back," I said, my fingers tightening around my phone, already knowing how this conversation was going to play out. Vincent let out a scoff, a low, condescending sound, the kind that used to get under my skin when we were kids, the kind that meant he was gearing up for an argument he thought he had a chance of winning. "Your house?" he repeated, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "You mean our house, the one we grew up in, the one Dad built for both of us." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me, already exhausted by the predictability of his response, already tired of having the same conversation I had been dreading since the moment the will was read. "No, Vincent," I said, my voice steady, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "I mean my house, the one that has my name on the deed, the one that belongs to me because that's what Dad wanted." The shift in his tone was immediate, the condescending amusement giving way to something darker, something sharper, something laced with bitterness. "Dad wouldn't have screwed me over like that," he snapped, his frustration bleeding through the phone, his denial as strong as ever, his refusal to accept reality just another extension of the same entitlement that had led him down this path in the first place. I didn't even bother arguing, didn't waste my breath trying to make him understand something he had already decided to reject. "Dad didn't screw you over," I said, my voice firm, refusing to let his anger shake me, refusing to let him twist the truth into something more convenient for himself. "You did that to yourself. You burned through every cent Mom left you. You wasted every opportunity. You made every bad decision. And now you're standing in a house that doesn't belong to you, trying to rewrite history." For a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make me wonder if he was actually listening, actually absorbing the reality of the situation, actually processing the fact that no amount of arguing, no amount of tantrums, no amount of manipulative tactics would change what had already been set in stone. But then, just as quickly as the silence came, it was shattered by his laughter, low, humorless, taunting, filled with a kind of resentment that had been festering for years, a wound he had never let heal. "You don't deserve it," he muttered, his voice quieter now, but just as venomous, just as full of anger. I clenched my jaw, inhaling deeply through my nose, forcing myself to remain calm, forcing myself to remind him of the one thing that mattered. "That's not up to you," I said, my voice unwavering, refusing to let him drag me into the same exhausting back and forth he had been trying to pull me into for years. "Now, I'm giving you one chance to leave before I bring the law into this." There was a long pause, the weight of my words settling between us, the reality of the situation pressing down on him, forcing him to acknowledge, even if only for a brief second, that he was not in control. Then, just as I expected, he let out a slow, mocking chuckle, the false bravado creeping back into his voice, the mask of confidence slipping back into place. "Yeah," he said, the challenge clear in his tone, the arrogance practically dripping from his words. "And what exactly are you going to do, little sister? Call the cops?" "You wouldn't." I smiled to myself, already knowing exactly how this would end, already anticipating his reaction, already prepared to give him an answer he wouldn't be able to ignore. "You want to bet?" I said, my voice smooth, my resolve unshaken. The next morning, I woke up early, made a few calls, and by noon, I was parked outside the house once again, but this time, I wasn't alone. A locksmith van pulled up beside me, the driver stepping out, clipboard in hand, glancing between me and the house as he confirmed the paperwork. "Lisa, right?" he asked, flipping through the documents, double-checking the proof of ownership before nodding. "All right, we'll get started. Shouldn't take long." I crossed my arms over my chest, watching as they unloaded their tools, watching as they prepared to undo the one thing Vincent thought had secured his place in the house, watching as his delusion started to crumble. And then, right on cue, the door flung open, and Vincent stormed outside, his expression twisted in rage, his voice already raised as he took in the scene in front of him, as he realized, for the first time, that he had never stood a chance. Vincent stood in the doorway, his face twisted in fury, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides, his entire body radiating the kind of rage that came from knowing he had lost before the fight had even really begun. He glanced at the locksmiths, his jaw clenching as he took in the sight of them working efficiently, their tools already dismantling the locks he had so proudly installed, the same locks he had believed would somehow erase my legal claim to the house. He turned his attention back to me, his eyes burning with resentment, his chest rising and falling with the sharp, uneven breaths of someone who had just realized that their false sense of control had been nothing more than an illusion from the start. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, sharp, filled with disbelief and barely contained fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his entire posture rigid, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to grab me by the arm and physically force me to stop. I tilted my head slightly, taking a slow, measured step forward, letting the moment stretch between us just long enough for him to really feel the weight of it. "I'm changing the locks," I said, my tone even, my expression calm, my amusement carefully hidden beneath a layer of icy composure. "You know, since you went ahead and did it without permission, I figured I'd return the favor." His face turned an alarming shade of red, his anger bubbling over into something just shy of uncontrolled rage, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was physically holding himself back from lashing out. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief, as if he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that I was standing here, undoing everything he had tried to take, refusing to let him bulldoze his way through another situation without consequence. "You can't just do this," he spat, his voice rising, his frustration spilling over as his gaze darted between me and the locksmiths, his desperation bleeding through every word. "This isn't over, Clara. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything from me, but you don't get to decide how this ends." I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice steady, my expression unreadable, my patience thinning by the second. "Oh, but I can," I said, my tone cool, unwavering, carrying none of the doubt he was hoping to find in my face. "And I just did. This house is legally mine. You're the one trespassing. You had a chance to leave on your own, but you chose to be stubborn, so now you don't get a choice." Vincent's breathing quickened, his shoulders rising with each inhale, his nostrils flaring as he tried to think of a way to twist this situation in his favor, but there was nothing left for him to cling to. He had already lost. He just hadn't accepted it yet. He took a step forward, his hands still balled into fists, his expression full of something unreadable, something dangerously close to panic hidden beneath all that fury. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice lower now, his tone carrying a sharp edge of desperation. "You think you're so much better than me, that you deserve all of this just because Dad left it to you. But you're just hoarding it while I have nothing." I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remind him, once again, of the truth he kept refusing to accept. "You don't have nothing because of me," I said, my voice steady, unshaken by the fire in his eyes. "You have nothing because you wasted every opportunity, because you threw away every chance, because you spent your entire life taking and never thinking about what happens when there's nothing left to take." For a moment, just a brief, fleeting second, something in his face shifted, something raw and exposed flickered behind his eyes, something dangerously close to the truth he had spent his entire life running from. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, It was gone, buried beneath another layer of anger, another mask of bitterness, another attempt to blame the world for the mess he had created. He took a step back, shaking his head, letting out a sharp exhale through gritted teeth. "This isn't over," he said again. But this time, the words didn't carry the same weight, didn't hold the same conviction, didn't land with the same force. I turned to the locksmith, ignoring Vincent's simmering rage, refusing to engage in another useless argument that would lead nowhere. "If he tries to interfere, call the police," I said, my voice loud enough for Vincent to hear, loud enough for him to understand that I was done playing games, that I was done giving him second chances, that I was done pretending he was anything other than a man standing in a place that no longer belonged to him. Vincent's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his anger, a crack in the armor he had built around himself, a sign that, for the first time, he was beginning to understand that there was no way out of this for him. He hesitated for just a moment before his face twisted into something ugly, something full of resentment, something that told me he would never forgive me for this, even though the only person he should have been angry at was himself. He turned on his heel without another word, stalking toward his car, his footsteps heavy against the pavement, his entire body rigid with unspent rage. I stood there, watching him go, waiting until the sound of his engine faded into the distance before I turned back to the locksmiths, my voice even, my posture relaxed, my patience finally rewarded. "Let's finish this," I said, watching as they completed the job, handing me a new set of keys, ensuring that, for the first time in weeks, the house was finally and undeniably mine again. Stepping inside, I exhaled slowly, closing the door behind me, locking it with finality, letting the silence settle over me like a blanket. I wandered through the familiar rooms, my fingers grazing along the edges of furniture that had belonged to my parents, my gaze sweeping over the framed photographs on the walls, the ones Vincent had no doubt ignored in his haste to claim the house as his own. Everything was exactly as I remembered, untouched by his hands, as if the house itself had been waiting for me to return. I made my way to the living room, sinking into my father's old armchair, the one he had always sat in with a book in his hands and a quiet, knowing smile on his face. I reached for my phone, pulling up the security app, my eyes scanning the footage, making sure Vincent was really gone, making sure there were no loose ends left to tie up. But as I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach, a whisper of unease creeping up my spine. Vincent had lost this round, but I knew my brother well enough to understand that he would never let it end like this, that he would never walk away without trying to take something else, that he would never accept defeat without making sure someone else suffered for it. And the worst part was, I knew exactly how desperate he had become. I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. The days after Vincent's eviction should have felt like a victory, should have given me a sense of relief, should have allowed me to finally close this chapter of my life. But instead, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. My brother had never been the type to accept defeat with grace, had never been the kind of person to let go of something he believed was his, had never been able to walk away from a fight without first making sure he had done everything in his power to destroy whatever stood in his way. I told myself that I was overthinking, that I was giving him too much credit, that he had already pushed himself into a corner with his own reckless decisions and had no room left to maneuver. But deep down, I knew better. That certainty came at exactly 3:12 a.m., when my phone buzzed against my nightstand, the screen illuminating the darkness of my bedroom, the familiar notification from the security system sending an immediate jolt of unease through my entire body. I didn't hesitate before grabbing my phone, my pulse already accelerating as I unlocked the app, my fingers tightening around the device as I pulled up the live footage from the front entrance. My stomach dropped the moment I saw him standing there, dressed in dark clothing, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his posture tense, his head turning every few seconds as if he was making sure no one was watching. But it wasn't just Vincent. Standing beside him, whispering something into his ear, was a man I didn't recognize, a man who looked older, rougher, the kind of person who didn't need to be told twice to do something illegal. My brother wasn't just breaking in. He had brought someone with him, someone who had no emotional attachment to the situation, someone who would have no hesitation doing whatever needed to be done if things didn't go according to plan. I didn't freeze. I didn't hesitate. I didn't give myself time to second-guess what was happening or allow myself the luxury of disbelief. Instead, I immediately called 911, pressing the phone to my ear, forcing my voice to remain steady even as the adrenaline surged through my veins, even as my hands trembled slightly from the sheer absurdity of what I was witnessing in real time. 911, what's your emergency? I inhaled sharply, keeping my eyes locked on the screen, watching as Vincent pulled something from his pocket, something that glinted under the dim porch light, something that made my stomach tighten with the horrifying realization that this wasn't just some desperate, last-ditch attempt to sneak back inside. My brother is trying to break into my house, I said, my voice steady despite the rapid thumping of my heartbeat in my ears. And he's not alone. I have security cameras. They're both standing at my front door right now. The dispatcher's tone didn't waver, her voice calm, practiced, professional, her words measured and direct as she immediately started gathering information, asking for my address, confirming that the security footage was live, assuring me that officers had already been dispatched to my location. I could barely process her voice, could barely register anything beyond the screen in front of me, beyond the way Vincent reached for the doorknob, beyond the way the other man pulled something out of his own bag, beyond the way my brother, the same person who had once been my childhood playmate, was now standing outside our father's house in the middle of the night, preparing to do something that would change everything. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street far sooner than I had expected, the wail of sirens cutting through the quiet neighborhood, sending an immediate ripple of chaos through the scene unfolding on my screen. The moment Vincent saw the police car rounding the corner, his entire body stiffened, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with a kind of realization that came too late, his plan unraveling before it had even begun. The other man, the one who had been standing beside him just moments ago, wasted no time before turning and running into the night, disappearing down the street, leaving Vincent standing there alone, frozen in the glow of the headlights, caught between the house he was trying to break into and the officers who had just stepped out of their vehicles, hands hovering over their weapons, voices sharp and commanding as they barked out orders. Hands where we can see them. I could see the exact moment reality finally sank in, could see the way Vincent's shoulders tensed, could see the way his fists clenched at his sides, could see the way his entire body screamed with resistance before logic finally overpowered whatever reckless impulse had brought him here in the first place. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't even speak as two officers grabbed him, turned him around, pressed him against the hood of the police car, and slapped the handcuffs onto his wrists. I forced myself to move, forced myself to unlock my front door, forced myself to step outside just as they were hauling him away, just as his head snapped up, just as his eyes met mine for the first time since this all began. His expression was unreadable at first, a mixture of shock and disbelief, a flicker of something that might have been betrayal, a glimmer of something that might have been regret. But then, just as quickly as those emotions had surfaced, they were swallowed by something colder, something more familiar, something that had always existed in the spaces between us. You called the cops on me. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry, wasn't the eruption of rage I had expected. It was quiet, flat, almost incredulous, as if the concept of consequences had never fully solidified in his mind, as if he had genuinely believed that no matter what he did, no matter how far he pushed, no matter how badly he betrayed what little remained of our relationship, I would never actually let him face the reality of his actions. I crossed my arms over my chest, tilting my head slightly, watching as the officers secured him in the back seat of the squad car, watching as the weight of the situation finally settled onto his shoulders, watching as he finally understood that this time, there was no way out. You broke into my house, I said simply, my voice carrying none of the emotion that churned beneath the surface. What did you expect? One of the officers turned to me, his expression neutral, his voice professional as he asked the question that would determine everything. "Do you want to press charges, ma'am?" Vincent's jaw clenched at the words, his shoulders tensing, his hands twitching against the restraints, his entire body caught in that space between defiance and pleading, that place where he wanted to fight, but knew he had already lost. For the first time, I saw something beneath all the anger, something beneath all the entitlement, something beneath all the mistakes. I saw fear. He thought I wouldn't do it. He thought I would let him go. He thought I would always be the one to clean up his mess. He was wrong. "Yes," I said, holding his gaze as I spoke the word that sealed his fate. "I am pressing charges." His face drained of color, his mouth opening as if to say something, as if to beg, as if to convince me to change my mind. But it was too late. The doors slammed shut. The squad car pulled away. And just like that, Vincent had finally lost.